It's time for Recipe of the Day. I love juicy roast pork, and I don't mean a pork loin here. Today I'm talking about pork butt. It's sometimes called Boston butt, but whether it is labeled pork butt or Boston butt, it does not come from the rear of the pig. It actually comes from the shoulder. So why does it have the word butt in its name? This goes back to some butchers from Boston back in the day who would take the lesser cuts of the meat and put them in barrels for storage and transport, and those barrels were called butts at the time, and so you get Boston butt roasts. I should also say that it is also sometimes called a blade roast, so that could be what you have. When I'm looking for these roasts at the grocery store, I usually want a boneless one just because I find the bone-in pork butt to have a weird bone through it, making it a little bit harder to carve, just difficult. So the boneless is easier, but actually the same essential recipe is going to work even with the bone in, and that's because the final cooking time is somewhat approximate because every roast is shaped differently. Your oven temperature is going to be slightly different. So you use a thermometer and you make sure you get it just to the right temperature. So whether it has the bone or not is not going to matter. You just don't want that thermometer touching the bone if there's a bone in there, right? I will also say that sometimes these pork butts come tied. So if there is string or any kind of net around them, you roast it with that on there. If it doesn't have it though, I don't bother tying it myself. I don't find that it makes a difference. This meat is actually really, really juicy when cooked slowly, and it's not going to risk, like, I talk about when you're doing like a turkey breast or other things where if it's unevenly cooked, the narrower or smaller part is going to be dry while the bigger part is more moist. That's not really going to happen here. The whole thing is going to be moist and juicy, even if it's not evenly shaped. The final thing I'm going to tell you about this recipe before I tell you to make it is that we are not searing this roast first. I hate that step of just about anything, and I've been eliminating it from almost all of my cooking, especially for like bigger cuts and roasts where you have to stand there browning it and then flipping it for all that time. I'm trying whenever I can for my own sanity to not have to do that, and so I develop the recipes that don't have that, and then you don't have to do it either, right? So we are doing that reverse sear technique that I love, that I'm sure you love at this point. So the roast is going straight into the oven, low temperature, cooking till it's the right temperature. Then it comes out and rests, and then it goes into a really hot oven to brown and crisp up and get that nice caramelization Maillard reaction flavor going on. We're doing it at the end instead of at the beginning, and it's more hands-off because it's being done in the oven instead of on the stove. So you're starting with a hopefully boneless 3 to 4 pound pork butt. If there's a lot of fat on one side, lightly trim that down. It's not going to do very much here, and it's going to stop the browning of the pork roast. Now, if you really like that brown fat, leave it all on there. You are fine. Then in a small bowl, mix together a half teaspoon of black pepper, 1.5 teaspoons of garlic powder, and a teaspoon of salt. And I like to do that in a small bowl mixed together so then I can go straight from the bowl to the roast, sprinkling, patting, flipping it over, back into the bowl, and then I'm not touching my seasoning containers with the hands that just touched the pork. You see what I mean? So if you mix the seasonings together first in a bowl and you're just using those seasonings in that bowl for this roast, then you can touch away. So you season the roast on all sides, top, bottom, all the way around, and then you put it into a roasting pan. I'm not using a rack for this. I don't think it matters. I do think it matters for like a pork loin, which is much leaner, and you want the air to circulate around so that it cooks evenly and so that you get it to just the right temperature and out, whereas this one is much more flexible, and if it's touching the pan, it's not going to make a difference. And then into that roasting pan, I like to put a cup of chicken stock if I'm going to be making gravy. If I'm not making gravy, I wouldn't bother. The chicken stock goes in there. It adds some moisture, which is nice for the pork, but it also catches any drippings coming off of the roast. Sometimes people run into trouble when they want to use their drippings for gravy, in that those drippings hit the pan is hot, and they start to kind of burn onto there, and then you get a bitterness in your gravy. By doing the stock, the drippings fall into the stock. They concentrate in there as the liquid is evaporating. You can add a little bit more liquid, and that'll dissolve any caramelization that's happening on the sides of the pan, and that way none of those drippings are going to burn. They're just going to be very, very rich in the bottom with that chicken stock. So where are we? You season the roast and you put the roast into a pan and you put a cup of chicken stock into that pan. And then that is going into a 300-degree Fahrenheit oven. Now, if you did not already preheat it, that's fine. This roast can be on the counter for up to 30, 40 minutes before it goes into the oven, coming to a closer to room temperature, but it doesn't have to. It can go straight in as well. So pretty much preheat the oven as you're taking the roast out, get it seasoned, get into the pan, and then pop it into the oven, whether it's at 300 or not. And then that is roasting for about 40 minutes per pound. So we're looking at a good 2.5 to 3 hours. It's a long time, but it's going nice and low and slow. The only thing you need to do is have a peek at that chicken stock in that pan. And if it is evaporated down to quite low, add a little bit more. The other thing that I will say is I do like to use a probe thermometer with a digital reader. The digital reader stays outside of the oven. The probe is in the roast, and then I can watch it. And I know exactly when it's getting close to done. If I'm going to start some side dishes or anything like that, I'm monitoring that and I can tell. I find that way easier. So you would have put that in before you put the roast into the oven, and then you have that digital reader on the outside. I'm going to link to my probe thermometer for you, the one that I use. It's really inexpensive. It's like $19. And I use it every time I'm doing any kind of roast. I use it for a bunch of things. I use it for steaks too, especially as I've told you, like if I'm doing a well done steak, I want to make sure that it is just the right temperature and not going over because it'll dry out, and any temperature really. You just want it spot on. The probe thermometer works really well. So then the temperature that you want this roast to get to might sound a little bit complicated, but trust me, it is not, and you're going to have a delicious roast. So you've heard me talk before that the safe temperature for pork is 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is the minimum, but that is not going to be good for this kind of pork. That's great for the lean, the loin, the tenderloin, those lean cuts. Those you want at 145. If you're somebody who doesn't like that slightly pink pork, then you go for 160 exactly, or maybe like 150, 155 and let it rise up to the 160. But those are perfectly safe temperatures and perfectly good temperatures for pork loin. When it comes to the pork butt and pork shoulder as well, you actually want it to be in there cooking low and slow for longer to really break down all that connective tissue and melt the fat. Think of this almost as like pot roast versus roast beef. You know what I mean? So this is more pot roast style. And so you want it like fully cooked and falling apart almost. Now, if you want this to be sliceable, you're going to take it out when it hits 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be delicious. If you want it like falling apart, shreddable kind of pork for like pulled pork, then you go to 180, even 185 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is the temperature that you're looking for. Then you pull that out of the oven, and you're going to let it rest for at least 20 minutes. 30 is fine. Even 40 minutes is fine. It's going to stay very warm in there. If you're making gravy, transfer the roast out of the roasting pan, and then you can use your drippings and anything from that roasting pan to make your gravy while the roast rests. If you're not planning to make gravy, just leave that roast in the roasting pan. It's fine to rest in there. And then after the 20 to 30 minutes, you're going to crank up the heat in your oven to 475 degrees Fahrenheit, and then that roast is going back in there until it is nice and brown all over. That's the reverse sear that I was telling you about. 20 to 30 minutes. Keep your eye on it. And then if you want it like really brown and almost crispy on top, you can even stick the broiler on for a few minutes, but just watch it because you don't really want it to burn, right? Now, you take it out of the oven at that point and you can slice it and serve it immediately because it already rested. Those juices that are right in the middle of the pork that are like bubbling all around and agitated, which is the reason why you don't want to slice a roast right when it comes out of the oven, those have already settled down, and this little bit of time in the hot oven has only really penetrated the outside. It's keeping things warm, but it's not really getting everything going again. That's not long enough for this sized roast. So you are good to slice it and serve it immediately. And you know, that is actually one of the perks of doing this reverse sear, I find, is that the amount of time the roast needs to actually cook is a little bit hard to guess for sure. It's going to be somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5 hours. but you're doing that resting time and you have that resting time to then make your meal, do everything else that you need. And also the time that the roast is in the oven after that, another 20 or 30 minutes. So then, you have lots of time to do that cooking, that last minute stuff and get it exact, everything ready at the same time to go to the table. I will put the link to this recipe in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there, or find it in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/recipeotd. And hey, just a quick note. I'm on a recording hiatus right now, so for the next little while, I'm replaying episodes from the archives, including this one. If you heard me mention a holiday, a season, or something going on in my life that seemed a bit off, that's why. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you're enjoying these older episodes. I am Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, cookfor2.us, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.